Welcome, everybody. It's so great to see you tonight at another Colleagues and Conversations. I'm Tracy Ashworth. I am the Director of Business Relationship Development. If you ever need to know anything about Yellowbrick or Synchrony, please feel free to reach out to me. My email's in all of the invitations. And at this point, I would love to turn this over to Dr. Michael Lasso.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. Welcome, everybody, again to another Colleagues and Conversations, and another one that I think will be very rich and engaging and very informative and helpful in terms of understanding certain kinds of dynamics. Before I get to tonight's talk, I want to give a brief preview of what's upcoming attractions as we're coming up to the end of the year. So next month, November 19th, our own Dr. David Barron, our medical director, will examine Becoming a Right Brain Whisperer, how understanding and interpreting enactment can promote safety in psychotherapy. And that's something we talk a lot about around here, right brain to right brain communication. And I think Dr. Barron has a really fascinating take on that. And then our annual conference is December 6th, and that's in person and also streamed. And that will be, it's our annual Menninger conference, and this year's Lindner Center for Hope is going to partner with us. And the topic of that will be working with Gen Z, opportunities and challenges. And they certainly can be challenging, and they certainly can give opportunities. And then we'll be back next year after the holidays with another roster of engaging talks. As you listen to tonight's talk, which surely will be rich and engaging, please note your questions or comments so that you can inquire about them during the question and answer portion of the discussion of the presentation. Dr. Wood will entertain questions after his talk, but feel free to send questions during the talk via chat, and I'll monitor those. I think Tracy will monitor them as well. Because of the richness of the material and because of the topic, I'm going to issue an unusual sort of framing here. And the material today will inevitably bump up against the difficult and sometimes tumultuous or strained political environment here and in other parts of the world. And I really can't imagine a way Dr. Wood can talk about what he's going to talk about without bumping into that in some way or another. At the same time, of course, Colleagues and Conversations is meant to be and to attune to intra and psychological dynamics, and we want to maintain that focus. As tempting as it might be to get into political discourse. And also we want to focus on our experience as clinicians. And of course, Yellowbrick does not endorse one political view or philosophy over another. As you probably know, or as you should have gotten a warning, we're recording today's events as we always do. Okay, without further ado, Richard Wood, Dr. Wood, received his bachelor's degree from Cornell and his doctorate from Wayne State University. He served as staff psychologist at Mount Sinai Hospital, where his focus was intensive psychotherapy with an outpatient population presenting with a broad spectrum of problems, as well as providing in-hospital consultations. He also was an associate professor in the Department of Behavioral Science at the University of Toronto Medical School. And for the remainder of his career, he was in full-time private practice. He's now partly retired, and he was president of the Ontario Psychological Association and one of the 6 founding members of the Canadian Association of Psychologists in Disability Assessment. He was director and founder of the Thornhill Multidisciplinary Assessment Center and is the author of 3 books, A Study of Malignant Narcissism, Psychoanalytic Reflections on Vladimir Putin, and his most recent book, Narcissism, A Contemporary Introduction. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Wolf. And thank you. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thanks so much, Michael. When I created this paper for this presentation, I discovered that it was a little bit too long to fit into the 75-minute time slot I was given. I've made the full version of the paper available to each of you through the moderators and the hosts so that you can refer to it after the session to review some of the ideas that we discuss here today and have the benefit of a more thoroughgoing consideration of the concepts we're about to explore. As I have suggested elsewhere, it would appear that we're living in an age of strong men. Increasingly, peoples of the world seem to be turning towards authoritarian figures to help them address their alienation, their vulnerability, their sense of injury, and their mistrust of established elites. Strongman figures promise to make diminished people great again. They offer to restore fractured cultural identities imperiled by waves of immigrants, by threats to global health, and by cataclysmic economic reversals. We are currently seeing a rise in populist movements, though not necessarily populist governments, inhabited by strongmen personalities throughout Western Europe. The Alternative for Germany, or AfD, the Hungarian Civic Alliance, the National Front in France, the Brothers of Italy, the Swiss People's Party, the Finns Party, the Party for Freedom and the Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands, All for Latvia, the Sweden Democrats, the Danish People's Party, United Serbia, the Freedom Party of Austria, Law and Justice in Poland, and the UK Independence Party, as just a partial list. Strong populist leaders have emerged in recent years around the world, and one such leader, Donald Trump, threatens to regain power in the United States. Although the Manchester Guardian suggested that the number of people living under a populist umbrella had fallen by 800 million to 1.7 billion in 2023 from 2020, Freedom House, which monitors the number of countries in the world where people can be considered to be living in free societies, concluded that global freedom declined for the 18th consecutive year in 2023. They noted that a total of 52 countries suffered declining freedom during that year, while only 21 realized greater freedom for their citizens. Strongman authoritarians are deeply entrenched in Russia, Vladimir Putin, China, Xi Jinping, North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and numbers of African and Middle Eastern countries, including, I would say, Netanyahu in Israel, Sinwar in Gaza, and Erdogan in Turkey. Other African countries, parts of South America, parts of the Far East, and both India and Pakistan were described by Freedom House as only partially free societies. Having tied ourselves to strongman visionaries throughout much of the course of human history, we are now finally in a position, largely as a result of our efforts to use science to know ourselves better, to understand who they are. From Rosenfeld, Kernberg, Kohut, Burke, Shaw, Mika, and myself, amongst numbers of other contributors, have made assiduous efforts to describe this personality. Any understanding of psychological dynamics is, of course, terribly imperfect, but it would probably be fair to say that we now at least recognize some of the salient psychodynamics that characterize many of these people. People like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, and yes, Donald Trump. People who could be described as malignantly narcissistic. As I review the various theoretical conceptions that various clinicians have pieced together describing malignant narcissism, you will undoubtedly notice that although there are some differences in the way that writers conceive of this entity, there are many points of agreement. I would ask you to remember, as I review varying conceptions of malignant narcissism, that it is still often regarded as a propositional diagnosis by many clinicians, although it is accorded recognition in the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual -2 and the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Chart -2. By the way, the focus will not be on individual personalities, but on the dynamics of malignant narcissism, as you'll see. Erich Fromm provided us with the first comprehensive portrait of this personality in his extraordinary work, The Heart of Man, published in 1964. Malignant narcissism, as opposed to benign forms of narcissism that were mitigated by the necessity of testing one's productions against reality through hard work, was informed by an enduring, intransigent sense that whatever one did was special simply because the self was experienced as extraordinarily special, set apart from the ordinary dictates and limitations of everyday life. Fromm's formulation implicated unyielding grandiosity as the core of malignant narcissism. He characterized malignant narcissism as not self-limiting and in consequence as crudely solipsistic as well as xenophobic. He saw the malignant narcissist as isolating himself increasingly in narcissistic splendor, unbound by the dictates of reason and love. Reason offended because it challenged grandiosity, and love was precluded by narcissistic failure to experience others as separate beings deserving of respect. Fromm warned that burgeoning grandiosity and omnipotence situated in a personality possessed of unusual assets might create opportunity for such personality to consolidate inordinate power. Granted such power, such individuals could annihilate opposition and bend reality to suit the dictates that extended from their lavish overvaluation of the self. Fromm referenced personalities like the Egyptian pharaohs, the Roman Caesars, the Borgias, Hitler, Stalin, and Trujillo, who had become, quotes, gods, limited only by illness, age, and death, end quotes. He regarded the distorting effect of grandiosity as madness, even though it is an attempt to solve the problem of existence by pretending that one is not human. Not surprisingly, like other authors, C. Mika and Wood, Fromm anticipated that escalating overvaluation of the self and escalating omnipotence must inevitably create failures for such personalities that would jeopardize the omnipotence they required to feel safe, producing catastrophic, potentially lethal depression. So for Fromm, then, malignant narcissism referred to a grotesque expansion of grandiosity and omnipotence that produced profound distortions of the human character. Taken by itself, his conception of malignant narcissism could be seen to be somewhat limited in its grasp. He contextualized it, however, as part of a triad of processes that, acting in concert with one another, could be expected to consummate themselves as human evil. The second leg of this triangle, a triangle which he referred to as the syndrome of decay, was a turning away from love. Was a turning away from love of life, biophilia, towards a love of death, necrophilous attitude. Necrophilous people were people who deal with murder, blood, corpses, skulls, feces, and sometimes also men transformed into machines or acting like machines. Such people strangle the joy out of life, stifling life, narrowing it down, cutting it into pieces. Fromm's words. Quite pointedly, Fromm commented that the death instinct represents psychopathology and not a normal part of biology. The third leg of Fromm's syndrome of decay was incestuous symbiosis, reflected in the desire for unification with an all-powerful other. He believed that the seductive allure of incestuous symbiosis was embedded in the universal experience of pre-Oedipal life. He stated that this incestuous striving in the pregenital sense is one of the most fundamental passions in men and women, comprising a human being's desire for protection, the satisfaction of his narcissism, his craving to be freed from the risk of responsibility, freedom of awareness, and his longing for unconditional love, which is offered without any expectation of his own loving response. He believed that such cravings rendered mankind susceptible to symbiotic yearning that affiliation with tribe, nation, race, religion, or God could offer. Incestuous symbiosis exposed one to potential loss or annihilation of the self, but it also offered the possibility of an expanded sense of self, one that was larger and possessed of a sense of power and authority that far exceeded normal human prerogative. As may be apparent, within the context of Fromm's framing of this concept, engaging in symbiotic embrace meant that one willingly surrendered independent judgment and thought to the realities that the symbiotic entity clove to. Being symbiotically bound meant that one was not free to have a conviction of their own. It also implied, as Fromm stated, that only those who share the same blood or soil are thought and felt to be human. The stranger is a barbarian. Fromm did not see the three legs of the syndrome of decay as forces that were independent of one another. On the contrary, he imagined that the more one was captivated by one of the forces that define the syndrome of decay, the more likely a person was to be dominated by the other two. Fromm extended his formulation to group narcissism, as have many other clinicians, writers, suggesting that pathological narcissism could manifest itself in large groups of people just as it could individuals, referring to such narcissism as social narcissism. He stated that it plays as a source of violence and war. Within the context of group narcissism, Fromm considered that the survival of the group depends to some extent on the fact that its members consider its importance as great or greater than that of their own lives. As an early and seminal conception of malignant narcissism, Fromm's work is striking in the degree to which he articulates destructive human processes that form, from his perspective, the foundation of human evil. Keep in mind, again, that malignant narcissism itself was only one part of a triad of forces that, acting together, had made its contribution to immense human suffering. From Fromm's perspective, malignant narcissism was not itself a unitary concept that led to the propagation of evil. Rather, it was part of a confluence of interrelated forces that accounted for potentially widespread devastation of the human spirit. Herbert Rosenfeld in 1971 identified a, quote, psychotic structural organization that was like a delusional world or object that appears to be dominated by an omnipotent or omniscient to extremely ruthless part of the self, end quotes. This psychotic organization was possessed of narcissistic self-sufficiency and appeared to dedicate itself to resist healthy dependence and recognition of another's value. He saw that patients were somehow seduced into surrendering the healthy parts of themselves, the part that yearned for connection and sustenance, replacing it with an ever-growing commitment to unfettered narcissistic grandiosity and cruelty. Adopting such a position meant that the patient undercut their capacity for thinking. In a 1964 paper, he had noted that investment in omnipotence occasioned denial of reality. Within his conception, one hears intimation of a divided self, its unhealthier narcissistic parts at war with and dominating a healthier self that have been forced to capitulate. Psychiatrist Otto Kernberg has made a deep investment in understanding malignant narcissism, writing very extensively and, one might say, both thoughtfully and brilliantly about this subject. Quotes, grandiosity, extreme self-centeredness, and a remarkable absence of interest in and empathy for others, in spite of the fact that they are still very eager to obtain admiration and approval from other people, end quotes, were hallmarks of the malignant narcissist's adjustment. So too were contempt, exploitation of others, intense pervasive envy, boredom, diminished capacity to eke lasting psychic sustenance from their lives, and an impoverished inner life devoid of good objects, that is, internal representations of rewarding, fulfilling relationships. Kernberg also importantly suggested that people who are malignantly narcissistic appear to demonstrate an inability to experience sadness, mournful longing, and depression. Being complete and flawless unto themselves, they can protect themselves from ever having to acknowledge their need for other people. Because malignant narcissists were unable to realize sources of satisfaction that derive from normal human interdependence, they were orally fixated, or one might say, voraciously, insatiably hungry. Kernberg suggested that any frustration of their needs could be expected to produce rage. In a particularly moving passage, Kernberg characterized the pathological narcissist's blighted interior, stating that what one saw was, quotes, the image of a hungry, enraged, empty self, full of impotent anger at being frustrated, and fearful of the world, which seems as hateful and revengeful as the patient himself, end quotes. For Kernberg, malignant narcissism represented an intersection between narcissistic personality disorder, severe antisocial behavior, significant paranoid trends, and egocentric aggression that could be directed towards self or others. In some respects, then, like Fromm, he saw what he called malignant narcissism as a confluence of different destructive forces acting in concert with one another. In a 1970 paper, Kernberg noted the structural similarities between pathological narcissism and borderline personality organization. Each was felt to use primitive defenses, including splitting, denial, projective identification, omnipotence, and primitive idealization to protect the self. Both groups were also seen to instigate conflict fueled by oral rage. He believed that the malignant narcissist was able to create a sense of personal integrity, which people struggling with borderline personality could not, largely because the former was possessed of an integrated, although highly pathological, grandiose self. Grandiosity, in other words, was conceived of as the glue which held this personality together, which echoed Fromm's formulation. Like Fromm, Kernberg also commented upon malignant narcissism in group process. In 1989, he suggested that under conditions of social upheaval, turmoil, or stress, and in the presence of a powerful paranoid leadership, the group can shift into the opposite extreme of endorsing a primitive, powerful, sadistic leader who will assure the group that by identifying collectively with the threatening, primitive aggression he incorporates, they will be safe from persecution by becoming persecutors themselves. I find this passage particularly poignant. It underscores our proclivity to make ourselves feel safer by moving from a position in which we feel oppressed or threatened to one in which we can generate intimations of safety for ourselves by violating others. It is a statement which describes significant portions of the ebb and flow of human history, in my estimate. In another context, Kernberg states that the existence of a paranoid ideology that explains to a mass its origin and sense, purpose and future may contribute to the severe paranoid regression of an entire community or an entire nation. He added that the pathological condensation of narcissistic and paranoid features in the syndrome of malignant narcissism represented the worst case but often typical scenario of autocratic leadership. Stalin and Hitler were given as examples. Endemic terror was an inevitable byproduct of such a community. He expressed his belief that opportunities for the exercise of absolute power provides individuals who can be described as malignantly narcissistic with unfettered means to express their sadism. In a chilling passage, he reflected that in such a context, open quotes, human beings may be treated as inanimate objects with the thoughtless, even bored dispensation of death. And finally, if I'm not wearing out my welcome by focusing on Kernberg, I would like to note one other particularly prophetic passage of his that seems very much applicable to our world today. The problem of alien cultures has become an urgently pressing one, as major migrations of population from one country to another, and particularly from different ethnic, religious, linguistic, racial, and cultural groups, have been taking place all over the world. Although Kohut did not make major contributions to the subject of malignant narcissism, he did make reference to messianic and charismatic forms of narcissism that sound very much like other clinicians' conception of malignant narcissism. Listen to his description of these groups of patients. These persons appear to have no dynamically affected guilt feelings and never suffer any pangs of conscience about what they are doing. They are sensitive to injustices done to them, quick to accuse others, and very persuasive in the expression of their accusations, and are thus able to evoke guilt feelings in others, who tend to respond by becoming submissive to them and by allowing themselves to be treated tyrannically by them. In another passage, he reflected upon the stunting of empathic capacity of this group of patients and mentioned that they assert their own perfection and demand full control over the other person without regard for his rights as an independent person. Kohut also addressed the subject of group process, proposing a concept he called group self. He could imagine circumstances in which individuals who endured narcissistic injuries might seek to melt into the body of a powerful nation as symbolized by a grandiose leader to cure their shame and provide them with a feeling of enormous strength, to which they react with relief and triumph. He believed that group pressure diminishes individuality, and like both Kernberg and Fromm, anticipated that group process could lead to a primitivization of mental processes. As he reflected upon group process, he imagined that applying a psychoanalytic understanding to it might make a, open quotes, contribution to the explanation of historical events and might facilitate man's mastery over his historical destiny. Daniel Shaw preferred the term traumatizing narcissism to malignant narcissism, feeling that the latter connoted pejorative attitudes towards people who had, in all likelihood, been badly traumatized themselves. Malignant narcissists were the predominantly overinflated, entitled grandiose narcissist who attacks, shatters, and suppresses others' subjectivity, displacing the legitimacy and authority of the other person's inner experience with the feelings and perception that the traumatizing narcissist imposes through acts of domination, typically to satisfy needs, to control, and exploit. Like Schengold, Shaw considered the destruction of another's subjectivity as the deepest and most traumatic wound that one can endure. As an aside, I would fully agree with him. Grandiosity, delusional infallibility, entitlement, and externalization of shame were also prominent characteristics of traumatizing narcissism. Having a relationship with a traumatizing narcissist necessitated that one either kneel at the throne or be banished, disinherited. In considering the kind of injury that the traumatizing narcissist inflicts on those close to him or her, Shaw focused on repetitive relational patterns that accumulate throughout the developmental experience. He stated that the traumatizing narcissistic parent envies and resents the child's right to dependency and demands, covertly or overtly, that the child recognizes the exclusive validity of the parent's needs and wishes, which means, of course, that the child is to be ashamed of his own needs and desires and view them as the parent does, as irrelevant or as contemptible, i.e., greedy, selfish, weak, morally abhorrent. The essence of people's vulnerability with one another, Shaw felt, was their need to feel loved and to feel that their love mattered to the person that they cared about. He defined love as a willingness to respect and enhance the other's uniqueness and subjectivity. In effect, the obverse of a narcissistic relationship. Craig Malkin, like John Gartner and Elizabeth Mika, identified Donald Trump as malignantly narcissistic in the dangerous case of Donald Trump, to which all three made a contribution. Because of constraints of time, no attempt will be made to describe these three clinicians' positions in any depth. A more complete characterization of their work and their understanding of malignant narcissism can be found in the extended paper, which I've made available to you. It should be noted that other clinicians who wrote for Dangerous Case formed different impressions of Trump diagnostically. Michael Tansey saw Trump as possessed of delusional disorder, Henry Friedman, paranoid character structure, and Lance Dodds, sociopathy. All three of these diagnostic impressions, however, embrace the damaged or absent empathy, impaired thought process, and the prominent paranoid elements associated with the diagnosis of malignant narcissism. Now I would like to focus on the model of malignant narcissism that I outlined in my first book, A Study of Malignant Narcissism. The model I am about to present you evolved from the experience of growing up with a malignantly narcissistic father. It is also founded upon over 50 years of clinical work with both patients who grew up with narcissistic others and some few patients who could be described as malignantly narcissistic themselves. And of course, as you will see, it very much derives from and has built upon the work of others who preceded me. My father gifted me two lengthy autobiographical statements that describe the circumstances and core emotional undercurrents that typified his childhood and early adult years. In some ways, a plaintive cry from the heart, and in others, deeply self-serving, the disclosures he offered helped me understand the origins of his narcissism. Equally important, I could turn to my own inner life as a means through which I could begin to apprehend what his was really like. I imagined that the devastation I carried inside was private and shameful. After the passage of many, many years, I began to recognize that what I was experiencing was a reflection of what he was experiencing. It was quite a frightening revelation. It meant and certainly felt like I was becoming like him. An excerpt from my book captures the nature of this revelation. The parallels between my internal realities while I was growing up, and for a long time thereafter, and my father's stood out in great relief and could be seen with greater clarity once an appreciation of his history had been developed. Both of us had felt both of us had faced adultification. He because he had been tasked with carrying his family financially, and me because I'd been tasked with carrying my family psychologically. Both of us faced formidable threat of depletion and endured starvation, though in different forms. Each of us had been encouraged to develop a sense of grandiosity. Me because I acted as my parents' therapist as a child, and him because he was asked to believe he could shoulder all the physical burdens assigned him. Each of us accommodated incestuous attachments to our mother. Each of us struggled with a sense of inner deadness, and each of us also contrived our lives rather than living them. Both of us spent much of our lives feeling unsafe and scared, and both of us were hypervigilant. And each of us was haunted by the monsters we were afraid we carried within us. His capacity to love was fundamentally compromised. I worried that I would never be able to. So many secrets for each of us to carry, so much to try to hide. In my book, I conceived of malignant narcissism as deriving from specific forms of trauma, most particularly, but not exclusively, severe early parentification, which demanded that a child focus nearly exclusive attention upon parental need, while their own needs were being either ignored or debased. Reminiscent of Shaw's appreciation of malignant narcissistic etiology. In response, the child becomes implacably mistrustful, anticipating rapacity from others rather than love or generosity. I also saw another course that could lead to malignant narcissistic posture. It was a course that I could feel that I was being drawn towards. The narcissistic predation that I was being subjected to felt terrifyingly like psychic annihilation. The self literally feels like it is dying. Shengold's term, soul murder, aptly captures this experience. One's subjectivity is being destroyed. I can remember the intensity of my own struggles. I felt like I was starving and disappearing. I could feel my father's hatred if I refused to yield to his toxic ascriptions. If I openly resisted him, I ran the risk of inciting more of his rage, which was already a crushing presence in my life. If I didn't find some way to push back, on the other hand, it felt like I was contributing to my own eradication. I also felt desperately that I wanted to resist being like him. Fortunately, my erratic, fragile mother was capable from time to time of raising her voice against his, showing me that there was legitimacy to what I was feeling and that there were other possibilities besides accommodating myself to the ugliness that he imposed on me and filled me with. It was clear that if I was to have any value, I was to take him in and replicate the repellent actualities that I saw in him and that I experienced in my encounters with him. I was also given to understand that I could never hope to approximate his greatness. At best, I could only be an echo, a pretentious wannabe, of the grandeur he conveyed that he possessed. In my situation, in other words, identification with him would have only further confirmed my inadequacy. What, I wondered, might have happened had my mother not raised her voice, and particularly what might have happened if she seemed to confirm that I was expected to become all that he was: self-aggrandized, larger than life, rapacious, relentlessly self-interested. Could I have resisted? I would have been allowing someone else to replace me, whatever I might have become under more adventitious circumstances, with a version of themselves. Either identify and give myself up to somebody else, or again, face annihilation. As I have suggested elsewhere, this is the exquisitely painful choice that Donald Trump faced. A different version of soul murder, but one that is just as devastating. It struck me that Trump's passage to becoming Fred Sr. may have been facilitated by native proclivity to be an aggressive personality in a way, perhaps, that his younger brother, Freddie Jr., was incapable of. So what Fred Sr. may have perceived as inherent strength in Donald may ultimately have facilitated the form of soul murder that Donald endured. The cost? Quite simply his humanity. Identification with Fred meant being like Fred, giving up connection with others, the ability to tolerate shared vulnerability, and a willingness, like Fred Sr., to engage in perpetual combat with the world around him through acts of brutality, exploitation, and insensitivity. Never again would anybody invade Donald. Never again would he have to accommodate others' voice. He would replace human relatedness with grandiosity, cruelty, and unbridled power. When I produced my second book, which I edited, I focused on Vladimir Putin, questioning whether my model of malignant narcissism fit him. As you may know, the book is entitled Psychoanalytic Reflections on Vladimir Putin, The Cost of Malignant Leadership. After reading 5 biographies and 1 autobiography about Putin, I began to see a different set of patterns emerging that could conceivably account for the malignant narcissism that I eventually concluded had come to define Putin. Admittedly, as one of my co-authors, Dr. Brent Willock, pointed out, there is probably a great deal that we don't know about the realities that attended Putin's first 10 years of childhood. What did stand out for me was evidence that he had to accommodate himself to a particularly brutal peer experience unfolding over numbers of years, in which he faced the likelihood of being ruthlessly bullied as probably one of the smallest boys in a group of formidable young toughs, many of whom subsequently developed criminal careers. In response to the frightening realities of his daily life, he seemed to have chosen to assert himself tenaciously, learning how to fight in a literally no-holds-barred fashion that gave no quarter and that effectively intimidated older, bigger boys, elevating him to king of his apartment courtyard. He amplified his skills by learning judo. Throughout at least a significant part of his later childhood and his adult years, extending into his time with the KGB, he persistently sought out others with whom he could provoke fights, even though, on occasion, it potentially compromised his KGB career. The willingness to fight defined him. He increasingly seems to have turned away from human relatedness, keeping his own counsel, playing his cards close to his chest, giving up very little about himself, and rarely exposing himself to need, intimacy, or interdependence. Acts of strength, dominance, ruthlessness, and cruelty compulsively defined him, as I would think is now very well known. Stephen Lee Myers, one of his biographers, devoted an entire chapter to the subject of poison. My colleague Brent's appraisal accentuated shattered attachments very early in Putin's life as causative. Where I saw malignant narcissism, he saw schizoid adjustment. As I pieced together my own formulation of malignant narcissism and the dynamics that seem to define it, I argue that malignant narcissism appears to be a subclass of psychopathy. I also wondered, as I have already implied, whether malignant narcissism might more properly be classified as a trauma disorder. That is, as a form of disorder that arises in response to profoundly injurious trauma experience. Within the context of the trauma perspective, one would anticipate that an affected individual would continuously reenact their trauma in various forms until they somehow either enjoyed resolution of the injuries they had endured, or alternatively, found themselves trapped in the same destructive patterns that had always characterized them. The implication of trauma disorder, at least within a psychoanalytic context, is that people struggling with profound trauma disorder cannot keep their secrets because they compulsively reenact the trauma that they have experienced in a variety of different forms. Enduring patterns that define their relationship with themselves and with others, I would argue, open a window into the nature of the trauma that they have experienced. Central to my formulation is the idea that malignant narcissistic personality organization evolves because it creates safety for the affected individual in response to profound early trauma. Safety is afforded through assumption of a grandiose, omnipotent self that confirms one is protected from early incursions the world imposed, which the self experienced as unbearable. Safety asserts itself as a strength to dominate and suborn others, rather than being exploited and overpowered in turn. By implication, such a personality has faced so much repeated, intolerable violation and threat that it must insulate itself against its own humanity, ensuring that it remains untouched by interactions that require vulnerability and openness to others. In the process, deeply rewarding, sustaining interactions that require empathy, compassion, respect for others, conduct mediated by decency, and a willingness to let others in one's world touch one deeply, all face compromise. Authenticating others' voices is a profoundly threatening undertaking. Strength means shutting others down and usurping their place, confirming in the process that the self never has to endure rapacity and humiliation. The investment in dominating others and keeping them out is rigid and unyielding. Cracks in the wall threaten the aggrandized self that is deemed, at least unconsciously, to be essential for survival. Any real or perceived attack upon the aggrandized self produces reflexive and ruthless counterattack meant to devastate the other. Relentless vindictiveness may ensue. Moreover, such behavior can and often does emerge in response to seemingly small slights, objectively out of all proportion to the injury being sustained. In such a context, love becomes increasingly improbable, inasmuch as it not only requires but incites celebration of others' individuality and their uniqueness. The malignant narcissist is therefore living in a solipsistic world, one defined by their own voice, their own emotional vicissitudes, their own needs, and their own prerogatives of action. It is a profoundly lonely, isolating place, but one that offers insulation against a world the malignant narcissist has learned, through unendurably painful experience, is malevolent. The malignant narcissist's life posture reflects imposing and one would say unyielding mistrust of other people. Such mistrust requires formidable walls to keep other people out, providing reassurance that others cannot obligate through bonds of fealty and affection. Relationships become largely transactional, defined by others' capacity to help the narcissist satiate their own needs. Very few people get inside and stay inside the malignant narcissist's inner circle for long. And those that do cannot lay claim to friendship, defined by openness, warmth, playfulness, and intimate knowledge of the other. A malignant narcissist rarely lets down his guard and rarely lets other people establish emotional purchase in his life. More typically, transactional interactions characterize his exchange with others. So long as mutuality of interest remains compelling, a relationship persists. When utility dissipates, relationships can end with startling abruptness. Close love relationships with a partner quickly become unsustainable. Genuine intimacy requires far too much vulnerability. The malignant narcissist must protect himself, both against the urge to love others and to be loved in return. In lieu of relationship, the narcissist craves conquest, risk-taking, confirmation of his prowess, and superficial allure in the object of his interest, none of which can satisfy him for long, producing a restless, bored relationship style that may expose him to multiplicities of partners, none of whom who can truly participate in a genuine, loving collaboration with him, because his defenses prevent him from doing so. The implacable mistrust which pervades malignant narcissistic adjustment means that the malignant narcissist must continually test his relationships. He does not have access to confirmation of his friendships or love relationships' viability that arises because two people can directly experience their depth of affection for one another. In addition to their transactional value, his relationships work for him because of others' willingness to accommodate themselves to his voice and to the manifestations of his will. Anyone whose personality becomes too well articulated begins to cross a line that incites rage and excoriation. Independence of thought and actions challenge essential narcissistic prerogatives and, by implication, the narcissist's survival. An offending personality must be neutered, humiliated, or if the offense is felt to be subjectively grievous enough, erased. Enactment of sadistic retaliation confirms potency. Sadism also enables aliveness and a sense of engagement with life in lieu of loving engagement with others. In part, the arbitrary shifting perspectives which the malignant narcissist presents, manifest in the many lies he tells, as an outgrowth of either his grandiosity or some perceived transactional end, serve the function of testing loyalty. If his adherents, including his closest staff members, can absorb his outlandish constructions and or the personal diminishment he sometimes abruptly and brutishly directs towards them. He is confirmation of both their loyalty and of their willingness to suborn their voices to his, regardless of the cost they are required to bear. They must content themselves that they can shelter within the implied promise of eventual redemption through his grandiosity. They must content themselves that they can shelter within the implied promise of eventual redemption his grandiosity and authority will offer them once they have endured the deconstruction he requires of them. Malignant narcissistic personalities often choose others as colleagues whose plasticity and or compromised ethics affords him the leverage that he needs to feel safe in his world. As a result of the dynamics that I've just described, the narcissist's interpersonal world is rather precarious, largely confirmed by acts of power and domination. The narcissist must demonstrate to himself that others will drink the Kool-Aid whenever he needs them to. They must show him that they can accommodate his shifting perspectives and prerogatives without raising meaningful challenge. In such a fashion, the malignant narcissist shows himself over and over that the people around him are prepared to bend themselves to his needs. Repeatedly violating others provides reassurance in the moment that all is as it should be, or as he prefers, with his world. In the long run, however, invading and subverting others further deepens mistrust, rendering the world an ever more dangerous place for him, and one that requires renewed and intensified efforts to ensure himself of dominance in an environment which, at some level, he appreciates he is making more and more enemies. The real point is that nobody can get too close or stay very close for too long. No one gets to touch the malignant narcissist in a personal way over an extended period. No one can lay claim to him or obligate him. He builds formidable barriers between himself and other people that often assume the form of withering contempt, humiliation, and implied or real threat. Conducting his interpersonal relationships in the way that he does means that he can never satiate himself and feel himself with that which truly sustains people. Mutuality of regard, warmth, playfulness, spontaneity, acts of decency, depth of affection, and behavior informed by genuine concern for the other rather than the self. In consequence, the malignant narcissist is starving. The walls he builds to keep others out and ensure that they cannot meaningfully touch him also prevent him from obtaining the supplies of nurturance that would relieve him of his insatiable restless hunger. Nurturance that would otherwise potentially provide him with a sense of meaning, the possibility of place in the broader human community, and a genuine sense of well-being and safety. More simply put, if one can't give, one can't get. Starvation produces rage and envy, inflaming the malignant narcissist's voracious, out-of-control needs. Rage that is never far from the surface and that can be easily harnessed by the narcissist's eternal hair-trigger vigilance. In effect, the narcissist, as my colleague Ian Hughes has pointed out, is perpetually envious of love itself. Love that he can't give and that he can't receive. Stuffing himself with the glut of power, status, money, and fame never really satisfies. It can't begin to meet the human needs that he requires himself to deny in order to protect himself. Ever mistrustful, continuously hypervigilant, always on the lookout for others' malevolent intent, the malignant narcissist inevitably creates devastating injury to those he experiences as enemies. Increasingly, his internal life becomes populated with dark images of predation, cruelty, and envy, creating a blighted internal wasteland populated by images of the ugliness that he enacts and that he experiences, much like Kernberg's formulation. He idealizes his ruthlessness, presenting it to the world around him as a desirable attribute that, he would argue, serves to protect people under his care. Inevitably, his own darkness escalates the devastated landscape inside, further exacerbating the starvation he must endure. Humanity recedes further. Cruelties compound themselves. Cruelty and risk-taking, as I have noted earlier, become the means through which he can make himself feel alive and engaged, however temporarily. Even his sadism, however, may eventually fail to reward him, as he becomes bored, as Kernberg would say, with his casual dispensation of death. His internal world increasingly consolidates his perception of the external world as being characterized by malicious intent. In this fashion, he comes to live in a projected world, one defined by his belief that others can be expected to be as rapacious as he is. Boundaries between what he experiences and that which others experience become increasingly permeable. Under the worst circumstances, he can become quite paranoid, either inflating or anticipating risk of attack that is out of all proportion to the risk that a given context creates for him. In such circumstances, he can act preemptively and dangerously, much as Lance Dodas has suggested. His cunning intelligence harnesses the deep cynicism of his view of others' occasions, relying on it to provide justification for the entitlement he wishes to consummate to feed his unquenchable appetites. His feral intelligence equips him well to read others' vulnerability and hesitation, which he would experience as weakness to be exploited and opportunity to be fulfilled. Broadly speaking, genuine difficulties, distinguishing between what he is feeling and what others are feeling, is part of a process in psychoanalytic literature referred to as projective identification. He not only projects his feelings and intentions onto others, but in attacking them or threatening them, gets them to act and feel in the way that he does, providing substantiation for his original perceptions. Conscious misattribution of blame, on the other hand, is referred to as blame shifting. Both are foundational processes in malignant narcissism. What renders them confusing is the way in which the malignant narcissist can shift back and forth between largely unconscious process, classic projective identification, and relatively conscious ones, varying levels of blame shifting, both of which can be embodied in a single exchange with him. Traditionally, projective identification and blame shifting can be seen to serve the function of ejecting the bad or destructive aspects of the self onto and into others, thus sparing the self a catastrophic confrontation with its most repellent parts. It can be seen from the foregoing discussion, however, that protection against the bad self often recedes in importance as projective identification and or blame shifting, or both, serve various important transactional functions, such as establishing and justifying entitlements, creating threat, eroding the selfhood of the other, obfuscating the malignant narcissist's intentionalities, impression managing followers' perceptions, etc., etc. Sorting through propositional motivations associated with both of these defensive operations can be quite daunting at times. As an aside, the best definition of projective identification that I have ever heard was offered by an old graduate school friend, Dr. Paul Van Wyk. Paul suggested that projective identification could be likened to a Dennis the Menace cartoon in which Dennis, trying to explain himself to his father, says, "It all started when he hit me back." Splitting is another core defensive operation believed to be a seminal part of malignant narcissistic personality organization. Splitting works in close conjunction with projective identification and blame shifting. Splitting allows the individual enacting this defense to break the world of people up into binary schemas that prevent one to apply gross, sweeping generalizations to others that render them either inordinately good or inordinately bad. Within my formulation of malignant narcissism, splitting too can be associated with differing levels of conscious intent. At one end of the spectrum, the other who has been targeted by this defense is experienced as profoundly repugnant or alternatively as extraordinarily decent. At the other, the conscious end of the continuum, transactional motivation assumes more prominence as perception of the other is deliberately manipulated to serve a particular end. Deliberate conscious defamation of a group of people may help consolidate unity in a larger group that a malignant narcissistic leader wishes to exploit. It can also be relied upon to generate high levels of threat and fear in society at large that renders its members more malleable. It could be used to punish a group of people that the malignant narcissist sees as standing in the way of his rapacities. It could permit the malignant narcissist to disguise and deflect attention away from other targets or other interests, etc., etc. Like projective identification and blame shifting, it can be immensely complicated to sort through, in any given instance, how a malignant narcissist is using splitting, i.e., as a conscious or unconscious action. The malignant narcissist's devastated internal life, his deep, unrelenting mistrust of others, and his abhorrence of vulnerability together mean that he stands apart from others' humanity and from his own. As a consequence, his humanity has to be simulated and contrived, curated in a fashion that makes it appear genuine, even though there are rarely genuine points of connection with others. A stiff, mechanical, or wooden presentation, the absence of self-depreciating humor that might confirm shared humanity, the absence of an engaging smile and infectious warmth might all attest to the contrivance that dominates these personalities. It's as if the music of everyday human interchange that informs and directs much of our action and our responsivity to one another is unavailable to them, like attempting to dance without being able to hear melody and rhythm. Often relatively raw, unmitigated acts of impulsivity coexist with contrivance, creating an uneven, discordant tableau, punctuated by orchestration and by chaos. One can speculate that the press of both immense need, immense rage and envy, and immense entitlement must result in impulsive acts, sometimes explosively expressed. In my original conception, impulsivity was as prominent a part of malignant narcissistic presentation as contrivance. I am still of this opinion. Both because the malignant narcissist's internal world and the external world are imbued with immense threat, he finds himself on a continuous war footing. Indeed, perpetual combat is necessary for the malignant narcissist to reassure himself that he can dominate the forces he experiences as assailing him and or that he imagines might initiate attack. Only by demonstrating to himself and others that he is bigger, badder, better, more ruthless, and more cunning than the other can he create momentary safety for himself. In the process, however, the list of enemies that press against him grows ever larger. The necessity to be prepared to engage in combat becomes more imposing. Antipathy surrounds him. He is, however, exceptionally well prepared for the war that he must face, and that, often in substantial part, he has created. His intolerance of weakness and vulnerability means that he has had to learn how to shut down empathy in order to protect the self. Freedom from empathy, in turn, facilitates an action-oriented, no-holds-barred assault when he experiences threat, when he wishes to exploit others through an aggressive exchange. Warfare, actual or figurative, is what he does best. The malignant narcissist needs his constituents to be scared. Fear creates obeisance and pliability. Join with me, he seems to say, and you can bask sheltered by my strength and my grandiosity, safe from my wrath. He reminds the governed, however, that he can turn his anger towards others within the state, subjecting them to persecution, humiliation, and worse, annihilation. Having targeted groups that he maligns within the state reminds everybody that nobody is really safe, that his reach is not to be denied. Endemically high levels of fear offer him opportunities to harvest people's worst impulses, redirecting them in a way that suits him best, further consolidating control. Perpetual war footing and perpetual combat comes at a high cost. Psychological literature attests to the significant constraints that high levels of fear arousal must have upon cognition. Thinking becomes simplistic, dividing events and people into binary categories, enabling splitting that belie actual realities. Nuance and discernment are replaced by the need to differentiate friend from foe. The language of fear-driven cognition is visceral and guttural rather than measured and thoughtful. It depends upon emotional invocation rather than invocation of reason and temperance. It impels the bearer to act in an unconstrained way to make sure that a source of threat is reckoned with quickly and mercilessly. So it is with the malignant narcissist and those who must live within the world that he creates. There are other costs as well, especially on the fragile remnants of humanity that the malignant narcissist still retains. Continuous threat produces dissociation or emotional blunting that further renders empathy and awareness of harm more inaccessible. It becomes easier to injure and do so without restraint the longer the malignant narcissist accommodates himself to the war environment he has generated. Because the malignant narcissist is loath to rely on others and authenticate their voices, to an ever greater extent he becomes his own singular recourse to authority and expertise. Others' contributions and the gifts that they might bring him through collaboration become ever more unlikely resources for him to access. Already inclined to hyperbolize his own knowledge and expertise as a means of both muting others and testing their loyalty with the sometimes abrupt shifts in perspective that he imposes on them, his investment in his own irrational authority intensifies. Science and reason, particularly reason informed by compassion, are displaced in favor of emotion-laden arguments, given credence simply because they are deemed to serve the malignant narcissist's agendas. What matters is that he said it and felt it and expects others to say and feel what he does. Reason is depreciated because it stands in the way of his authority and his ability to arouse and manipulate the people he governs. As these patterns replicate themselves, his judgment becomes more and more tenuous and more detached from important realities that would otherwise require constructive attention. When increasingly extravagant errors of judgment occasioned by his isolation and his misappraisal of his own ability lead to crises that unseat his grandiosity and his obdurate faith in himself, there is great danger that his decisions will become proportionally more destructive to the human community, as did Hitler's invocation to German leadership to destroy industrial infrastructure in Germany to a degree that would have ensured impoverishment and social wreckage for generations to come. Compromise, grandiosity, and personal identity felt like an annihilatory experience, leading Hitler to direct his suicidal despair towards the nation as a whole, attempting to fatally compromise it in the way and to the degree that he felt compromised. His rationale? Germany had failed its Darwinian task and no longer deserved to exist. The conflation of leader identity and national identity that one sees in malignant narcissistic leadership creates extraordinary risk for everybody. In other words, when the leader's inherently flawed investment in grandiosity leads to his own personal disintegration. Like Fromm and like Kernberg, I see malignant narcissism as a turning away from life and life-affirming activity towards impoverishment and death. The malignant narcissist, like the legendary vampire, is confirmed to a half-life, one in which he is eternally hungry, unable to nourish life in others, constrained and said to always take it in his desperate attempt to fill himself and create safety for himself that he can never have. Please refer to the paper I provided you or that you will receive for a more extended list of the characteristics dynamics that I feel typify malignant narcissistic personality functioning. For ease of consideration, I abstracted these dynamics into a list of 7 salient characteristics: obdurate investment in strength and intolerance of vulnerability, compromised empathy and demonstration of marked cruelty, destruction of others' voice, a personal presentation marked by investment in contrivance and avoidance of intimacy, impulsivity and recklessness, projective identification, splitting and blame shifting, and mock impoverishment of one's inner life. My work led me to conceive of malignant narcissism as a defense against love. So, why do malignant narcissistic leaders attract so many devout followers? Composing a credible answer will surely reflect, as it must, as much about the realities and vulnerability that we all carry inside us as it does about the malignant narcissist himself. A malignant narcissistic leader engages so many of us because he speaks to our alienation, underlying sources of injury, fear, uncertainty, inadequacy, and inequity. Real calamities such as war, profound economic reversals, threats to cultural integrity, acts of widespread prejudice and hatred, wide-scale threats to health, etc., all lay a groundwork for a sense of alienation that can be exploited. In the absence of such imposing threat, a malignant narcissistic leader may create threats that don't exist, but that feel credible, or exaggerate ones that are genuinely present. It would be fair to say that leaders like Trump and Putin, for example, have done both. In essence, malignant narcissistic leaders rely upon fear to draw their followers towards them. In acknowledging the fear that they elaborate or exacerbate malignant narcissistic personalities, establish a sense of empathic attunement with those that they seek to seduce. The malignant narcissistic leader is seen to understand the untoward realities that people feel characterize their lives and that no one else has been willing to address. The malignant narcissist further consolidates his purchase with his intended followers by speaking with great authority. He is the only one, he tells those he would entrance, who is equipped to solve the alarming problems that he has been perceptive and empathic enough to identify. An air of certitude and authority is very powerful. The Milgram experiments, which have been replicated in a variety of forms, show us that even bright, well-educated people are willing to inflict lethal levels of harm on others simply upon receiving instruction to do so from an authoritative other. Adorno also made us aware that certain cultural practices that typify a given culture may contribute to culture-wide receptivity to authoritarian voice. Lifton draws our attention in turn to the concept of malignant normality. Malignant normality refers to the idea that we can become inured to acts of inhumanity and indecency because they are so widespread in a given culture, they have become normalized by it. Hannah Arendt's concept of banality of evil asks us to consider that many people who perpetrate evil at the direction of others are possessed of rather quotidian personalities themselves. Her formulation, however, also foreshadows, to my mind, the Lifton concept. We don't see, think about, or feel the implications of that which is so commonplace to us. We are drawn instead by our membership in our home culture to accept cultural practice as a means of affirming our belonging to our group and our identification with it. In my first two books, A Study of Malignant Narcissism and Psychoanalytic Reflection on Vladimir Putin, I emphasize the importance of group belonging and identity as an immensely important driver of human behavior, as indeed have many other writers, as we have seen. Dispossessed people that a malignantly narcissistic leader addresses have now been given a righteous cause to pursue. In Trump's case, for instance, make America great again, a hearkening back to imaginary better times that Trump promises to restore. Joined by unity of purpose and a nostalgic reinvocation of an idealized past, they can restore meaning, pride, and sense of community, by any measure, a very powerful inducement to draw them into MAGA. The vague promises and abstractions which Trump provides allow his listeners to project whatever they might wish into that vision of better life. There is another powerful reason people are drawn to movements like MAGA. It frees them from having to accommodate accountability for their own actions. They no longer have to mediate their own impulses, deciding what is moral and what is not. The leader makes those choices for them, deciding when it is appropriate for them to unleash the malignant parts of themselves that we all carry inside, and when it is not. Elsewhere, I have argued that humanity is frightened by the chaotic, impulse-ridden realities that our inner world presents us. In response, we seek out autocratic structures to help us wall off and govern those parts of ourselves we deem most unacceptable and most dangerous. I have speculated that repressive cultures that expect us to shutter unacceptable parts of ourselves rather than learning to integrate them into our humanity create greater receptivity to authoritarian leadership. The malignant narcissistic leader is also able to capitalize upon the ecstasy that human beings experience when they surrender themselves to another identity and to a new love relationship. Who of us can deny that we haven't been captivated by the delicious, seductive feelings that arise in us when we join with another in a promising union, what Fromm referred to as incestuous symbiosis? That experience of union or coming together carries with it potentiality for growth and for personal enrichment many of us find well-nigh difficult to resist. Indeed, many of the movies that we watch, romantic comedies, focus on these feelings, often failing to look into the realities of the relationship that unfold after initial infatuation. We seem to be eager, in other words, to confirm for ourselves infatuation is an end and justification in and of itself that will offer us the personal resolution most of us are looking for, notwithstanding formidable evidence that life is a good deal more complicated than that. Very fundamentally, the malignant narcissistic leader is inviting his followers to partake in the grandiosity and implied power of his dominance and authority. They too can feel bigger than they have been, more expansive, more influential, if only they would twin themselves with his priorities and the identity he assigns them. Once they have done so, they must be careful never to step outside the bounds of discretion and judgment that he prescribes for them, especially as he expands his power. Their voices must align themselves with his. Authoritarian leaders consolidate their authority throughout the continuous invocation of fear. To disagree is to face censure, punishment, or even the threat of physical reprisal and annihilation. Followers are inevitably asked to turn their wrath and the intolerable levels of vulnerability they experience towards those a malignant narcissistic leader would target, both inside the state and outside it. As malignant narcissistic personalities consolidate their control of a given society, progressively devastating voice and democratic process, fear and repression become ever more prominent characteristics of day-by-day life. Like the malignant narcissist, everyone begins to feel dead inside, no one feels safe, and everyone struggles with the fear that the leader's wandering hatreds can direct themselves towards them. As people direct their growing rage and fear towards prescribed enemies, playing the part of bullies themselves to make themselves feel safer, they inflict devastating wounds to their own humanity. As they do so, their internal worlds increasingly begin to replicate the leaders, marked by growing and ever-expanding hatreds and prejudices. As I may have said earlier, the malignant narcissist's envy of others' decency and love compels him to deconstruct them, replacing their humanity with a devastated version of his own that he possesses. Almost done, by the way, guys. Truth, factuality, science, thoughtful, nuanced response, and appreciation of complexity all endure depreciation under malignant narcissistic leadership. In their place, decision-making driven by affects like fear, hatred, and bigotry assume ascendancy. Thinking becomes more binary, marked by simplistic distinctions between good and bad, friend versus foe, good versus evil, facilitating prejudicial acts and decision-making, which serves a malignant narcissist well in his pursuit of perpetual warfare. The malignant narcissistic leader provides justification for the hatreds and the inevitable violence that he creates and instigates by providing the population with ideologies that seem to rationalize and substantiate the devastation that grows out of his leadership. In some cultures, the internet offers him the means to identify what people in various strata of society want to hear. He can oblige them. He can contrive the mask and the face that suits his audience. While the various ideologies he may contrive are presented with great flourish and great conviction, it is important to remember, again, that his relationships are essentially transactional. He is only interested in the expansion and consolidation of power, dominance, wealth, etc. The only goods that he really cares about. Ideology is only a means to an end. It is not possessed of genuine conviction. It is also important to consider that the internet allows him to tap into existing or growing prejudicial attitudes that he can mine and exploit, finding new groups that he can target, internal enemies, that people can direct the pain and vulnerability he occasions into acts of hatred and cruelty towards others, distracting them from the painful realities he has created for them.
Thank
you very much.
On that plan.
So we're all done.
Thank you. Just want to give people a few moments of pause. It's incredible. It was incredibly rich and thorough. So if people, have questions, send through chat, or you can ask directly, or comments. One thing that, we had discussed this paper here a little bit today. One thing we were talking about was how, in some way, to, in a sense, to stand up to the force of this kind of personality structure directed toward you requires a certain amount of healthy narcissism. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about how you see a less malignant narcissistic stance versus a malignant one?
I think I understand where you're heading, Michael. In various papers that I've written about malignant narcissism, I've talked about ways in which we can insulate ourselves against the impact of malignant narcissistic leadership. I think that's kind of where you're heading.
Well, our leadership, or even in facing a partner, or a family member or a parent, where you have this. I mean, I think in some ways both.
I think within the context, at least in my clinical experience, within the context of an interpersonal relationship or relationships, as might be reflected in family dynamics, it's pretty hard for people to coexist with somebody who's malignantly narcissistic without exposing themselves to erasure and psychic annihilation. I don't think, in other words, that there's anything constructive one can do. Perhaps in a family context, the only option one has is substantiating the self by leaving the relationship and trying to find a safer place and healthier relationships to turn to that are genuinely, truly nurturing as opposed to annihilating. In the context of leadership, I think there are a number of alternatives that we can pursue. I'm hesitating because I'm not sure how plausible any of them really is, particularly in the current context that we're now living with in the world. My colleague in Ireland, Ian Hughes, who's also been a writing partner, has written, I think, a very important book about disordered minds. He makes the argument that the only way we can protect ourselves against this kind of leadership is by protecting democracy, as imperfect as it is. And certainly God knows democracy is capable of very destructive acts. But anyway, Hughes details the various checks and balances that have been built into democratic structures that he argues were deliberately built in, at least maybe on an unconscious level, to protect us from malignant narcissistic leadership. I've argued that I think the arts are terribly important to us. They help us hang on to our humanity. They help us empathize. They help us consider alternate forms. They humanize other people. I also think that education plays a terribly important role. I think people have to be taught, however, that they can speak out on their own, that they can present their own unique points of view, even if in doing so it separates themselves from the group. Cultures have to foster independence of thought and independence of spirit. And many cultures don't do that very effectively, including, I think, the culture in the United States, which is where I grew up. I don't think it was any accident that people behaved as they did in the Milgram experiments, or as they did in the Stanford prisoner experiments. We do foster obeisance and compliance with cultural standards and attitudes, and it takes a lot of courage to change that stuff. I mean, I was in grad school in the late '60s, very, very early '70s, in the middle of the Vietnam War and in the middle of all the civil rights stuff. And I guess it was also a time when society was reeling from the impact of the birth control pill. Boy, that was a tough time. People found the courage to speak out. They found the courage to take a stand. But I don't think we've been able to do that effectively since that time. And that scares me. And I don't know how you help people to move into that kind of position. I think a lot of the people who are casting their votes around the world for populist leaders really aren't equipped to recognize the threat which I perceive these people to represent. I think it's going to be a long time before the population becomes discerning enough for us to be able to protect ourselves effectively. And we're facing a whole bunch of challenges that require collaboration rather than societies siloing themselves into self-interested compartments, like wealth inequality and climate change and worldwide health threats, etc. Sorry, that's probably way too long an answer.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I mean, I'm also thinking about they're in the consulting room. Like, what's been your experience when you've had a patient who had a malignant narcissist as a partner or a parent, but hadn't quite connected the dots yet, where you're kind of witnessing the pain being inflicted on them, and then becoming lost in that, but not yet sort of gotten themselves out of it?
For me, it's kind of an awkward dance, because you haven't actually, many times you haven't met the malignantly narcissistic parent. And so, I mean, I don't know how you guys feel, but when people are in the consulting room, I feel like I'm not only there with the patient, but with various members of their family whom I've got to treat with respect. So I really want to take care that I understand the dynamics that are unfolding in the family. Oftentimes, when I'm working with a family with a malignant narcissist, I end up seeing 2 or 3 family members because lots of people are really distressed. So I begin to be able to get a sense of what's happening. It means articulating the dynamics, appreciating people's pain. Ultimately, it oftentimes means giving people permission, helping them find the means to separate themselves from the malignantly narcissistic other. On very few occasions, maybe 5, 6, 7 times in a 50-year career, I've had malignantly narcissistic patients present themselves. In all but one occasion, they were there because their employer said, "You're going to get help. You're going in and you got to see a psychologist. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to work here any longer." One guy that I saw that I worked with over a long period of time was absolutely horrified by who he was. I was quite astonished and said, "I know what I am. I know what I become." And I had actually seen some of his coworkers because I was consulting at the company. And he said, "I'm a terrible person and I have to do something about this." And the guy actually worked hard. And we were able to make sense out of his background and where the malignancy arose. He made apology to his family, but that's 1 out of 6 or 7 people. That's not what you experience. I mean, working with people like this, I'm assuming you guys all have had this experience from time to time. As Kernberg would say, it's not a pleasant experience. I mean, you're diminished and humiliated and attacked and viewed with skepticism. You're only there because you're wanting to make money and you're trying to perpetuate therapy, et cetera, et cetera. It's bloody impossible to breach the mistrust and establish a relationship. That's been my experience anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and as you were saying, the projection and projectile identification becomes so powerful that as a therapist, you're, working just absorb that in a useful way.
I know we're about to end here. So thank you, Richard, for a really rich and intriguing presentation and, today's world. I would want to know whether or not you have any comments or experience with working with these individuals in group psychotherapy, psychodynamic group psychotherapy, either in addition to or instead of individual psychotherapy where the narcissistic, kinds of sensitivities and power struggles are perhaps, all the more intense.
Jesse, I'll be very honest with you. I'm a shitty group therapist. So I tend to stay away from group work. It's just not a strength. But I can imagine what that would be like. What a challenge. I gather you've had this experience.
We do on a regular basis at Yellowbrick.
Wow.
I would say perhaps the results are limited in terms of the malignant narcissist person, but facilitator can help the other members of the group in their courage and strength to not be so obsequious in relationship to those folks in their lives, like the malignant person.
Yeah. That's lovely. I mean, the danger is, of course, that you, in an effort to protect some of the other personalities in the group, you end up kind of villainizing. I would imagine it feels like you can swing over into villainizing the destructive personality.
Well, I think your talk really works in the opposite direction in that it really makes it clear that people shape in this direction because of a sense of their own traumatic deprivation and shame-driven rage, and powerlessness,
Right.
And so in a group setting, some of the narcissistic sensitivities can be, I would say, distributed, if you will, and there can be a group empathic relationship to the person who, can be seen as needing nourishment in the way they go about being, assaulted.
Yeah. Are you able to induce these people to accept the nourishment that the group is willing to offer them?
Bryn may be better able to comment on that since he's got more of the direct experience of the interpersonal group psychotherapy at Yellowbrick. But I would say it's variable, but Bryn may want to comment.
It can definitely happen that way. It depends on the cohesiveness in the group,
Right.
because a very cohesive group can function as a fairly empathic holding environment that allows even the more malignantly narcissistic and destructive members to it holds a space open for them to feel less persecuted by the recognition of their aggressive attacks or free-floating aggression. But my experience largely has been similar to what you described, Richard, as just those malignantly narcissistic individuals who find their way somehow into our consulting room are, first of all, few and far between. And those who manage to stay more than a handful of times without, blowing things up, are even fewer.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. It's interesting. The literature talks about malignant narcissism as being largely a male challenge rather than female. There's Kernberg describes females who are malignantly narcissistic, but I'm not sure I would entirely agree with his characterization of some of the clinical examples he gives.
Right. No, it's been our experience that I think it's been our experience at Yellowbrick. It's fairly evenly divided.
Oh, is that right? Males and females?
That's been our experience, I think.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Have you written about the groups being capable of demonstrating a nurturing response that the malignant narcissist is able to respond to in a positive way?
Well, yes, not me personally, but our group has published a description of the group model and the process.
I'd love to see that if you would be willing to forward that on.
I think we can arrange that. Thank
The
you.
new material, yeah. I mean, I think it's also interesting that as Bryn said, it creates a holding environment for the narcissist, but it also, I mean, and if it's effective, it can also create a safe space for the narcissist to get feedback from the peers about what his or her behavior is doing to them in a way that can be taken in as much as someone will take that in. And in others, in a way that's not defended against immediately. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. We do need to stop, unfortunately, because this is really great. And as Dr. Viner said, this is really illuminating great material, and appreciate you sharing it with us.
Oh, I thank you for the opportunity. Thanks everybody for attending. If people have questions that they want to raise with me, please, I mean, I guess you could pass on my email.
Yeah, yeah, we can
Michael.
do that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to people.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.